Hello, everyone who's just joined us. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to allow other people to enter the Zoom. So we'll be getting underway in about a minute or two at the most. So just bear with us. For those of you who just joined, and for those of you, forgive the repetition for those of you who haven't, we're just going to wait a minute or so to allow other people to connect and join the Zoom, and we'll be getting underway very shortly. Hi everyone, we're just going to start in about 30 seconds or so, just to allow some more people to join us before we get underway. So I think that will do it. A warm welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Jonathan Brinsden. I'm a charity partner here at BDB Pitmans. For those of you who don't know us, we're a law firm, and our charity team here looks after charities at every stage of the life cycle, from registrations to fundraising to mergers and collaborations and everything in between. I'm very pleased to host this afternoon's event and welcome you to the first of 4 slimline webinars which will be taking place over the next few weeks with our friends from the accounting firm Price Bailey. Our theme is the charity of tomorrow, and together with our friends from Price Bailey, we will be looking at some of the trends and operating practices which have arisen out of the pandemic and now look like they're here to stay. Zoom webinars, of course, being one of them. But we will also be crystal ball gazing about things which are likely to play a part in the running of a charity in the not too distant future. So over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be thinking through a variety of issues, from fundraising to charity governance, to data and digital and property considerations. And I hope you will find time to join us for those too. However, over the course of the next half an hour or so, we're going to focus on an area where there has already been something of a revolution, and that is the post-pandemic working environment. Leading the charge on this, we will have 2 expert speakers. Caroline Yarrow, a partner in the employment team here at BDB Pitmans, who specializes in charities. Hello, Caroline. And we will have Michael Cooper-Davis, a director who is part of the charities team at Price Bailey. The presentations are expected to last about 30 minutes or so, but we will have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So please do make use of the chat function throughout for any comments or observations. And I will field those questions at the end of the presentations. And so without further ado, I will pass over to Caroline, and I will see you all at the end of the presentations for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Melissa, if we could start with the first slide, please. So as Jonathan has said, I'm Caroline Yarrow. I'm one of the employment partners here at BDB Pitmans, but I have a particular sort of specialism and interest in employment law for charities, and for a wide variety of charities from small to very large. I'm going to talk to you today in brief about 3 topical issues that we're seeing arise for a lot of clients, both in the third and not-for-profit sectors as well as more widely. So mandatory vaccinations, obviously a huge topic at the moment, impact of remote or hybrid working on pay, and home versus work locations. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So I think just as a starting point, clearly there are a number of key advantages in terms of looking at whether or not staff should be required to be vaccinated before they can come into work. So vaccination passports might be one way of expressing it. So you've clearly, the more people are vaccinated, the more this will help potentially to protect staff, others, so whether those are customers, suppliers, clients, obviously in the charity world, service users, many of whom may be vulnerable for one reason or another, and really to prevent and reduce the spread of the virus, which obviously is a good thing from an individual workplace perspective, but we all have our duty more widely to society because we're all in this together in a sense. Also, a mandatory vaccination policy, at least in theory, could reduce the effect of staff sickness absence and the resulting impact that may have on the charity and its operations. And in terms of sort of pure data metrics and reporting, if you have information to hand as to who is vaccinated, who is not vaccinated, it could help monitor the situation and work out how vulnerable the organisation may be to coronavirus infection, which could help with operational aspects as well. But clearly, alongside all of those advantages, there are a number of risks inherent in looking at whether or not you can or should impose a mandatory vaccination policy. So I think the first of those is actually the current government position. So as I'm sure you'll all know, other than for the care home sector, which from 11th of November will include a mandatory requirement for people working in that sector or providing services into that sector, so hairdressers, physiotherapists, whatever it may be, coming in to assist care home residents. There is no current mandation from government that people must be vaccinated to attend for work. So I'm not going to go into the care home sector requirements today. That could be a webinar in itself. So essentially, the government's position is that, save for the care home sector, vaccinations are strongly encouraged, but they are not mandatory. So if you are looking individually within your organisations at imposing a mandatory vaccination policy, you are going to have to justify that on an objective basis and really spell out why it is that you need all of your staff to be vaccinated. I think it's also fair to say that there is still a fairly inherent degree of scientific uncertainty in terms of the effect of the vaccines. So it's been recommended as a safe and effective way of reducing the chances of suffering from COVID, but the data on whether it prevents transmission at all is still being examined. So the government is not suggesting that vaccination is a substitute for proper workplace COVID health and safety risk assessments and measures. So that particular uncertainty may actually water down any arguments that a compulsory vaccination is the best and most proportionate way to protect your business. So I think it's also worth mentioning reputational harm. Many of you may have seen earlier on this year some fairly, I think it has to be said, negative press around the business Pimlico Plumbers and the very vocal opinion of the leader of that business that they were going to have a no jab, no job policy. So I think there are potentially reputational considerations to take into account on that front. So, but just moving on and briefly to look at some of the legal issues around mandatory vaccination policies. Firstly, obviously health and safety is of paramount importance, and employers are under a legal obligation to protect the health and safety of their staff. If you are minded to look at a mandatory vaccination policy, then you would need to undertake a full risk assessment as to why this is required, rather than simply just referring back to government guidance. And you would also need to consult with staff on that requirement. And the risk assessment should consider what other alternatives are available to vaccination if staff do not agree to be vaccinated, or for that matter, for some reason cannot be vaccinated. And there will be some pockets of staff that may fall into the latter category. So things that may feed into that risk assessment is, well, actually, could you ask or should you ask staff to do regular lateral flow tests before they come into work? Do they work in a particularly vulnerable area in terms of the people that they're coming into contact with? And it may well be the case that a one-size-fits-all is not appropriate. The nature of some workplaces, of course, I think may mean that a prerequisite of having a mandatory vaccination could potentially be justified. But as I said, it will all come back to that risk assessment and the precise nature of the role and the work activities being undertaken. This area, I think it's fair to say, is fraught with the risk of employment tribunal claims if you are imposing or looking to impose a policy that everybody has to be vaccinated. So I think the first one of those to flag is the risk of discrimination claims. Just a few areas that could be engaged. Firstly, I think you need to consider about religion or belief. So, for example, there may be concerns that the vaccine could have been made from animal products, or development may have involved animal products or testing. So, depending on the nature of those animal products, that may be an issue for certain employees who hold a particular religious belief. Ethical veganism has been held to be a philosophical belief, so that might be an issue for employees who are vegans, for example. And although the jury is very, very much out on this, but I think we will see cases on it, is the extent to which anti-vaccination beliefs could be treated as a philosophical belief, which should be protected in its own right. Disability, I've touched on this already. So if an employee has a disability which makes it difficult or very dangerous for them to have a vaccination, then obviously a mandatory vaccination policy would cause issues for them. Sex, pregnancy and maternity. So I think although the advice is very much that pregnant women should be vaccinated, and the cases in terms of pregnant women who are becoming ill and who are not vaccinated may perhaps start speaking for themselves. I think more research probably is needed. So you may well find pregnant employees or those trying to conceive expressing concerns about a mandatory vaccination policy. And then there may also be issues with race and age, given statistics in terms of certain different ethnic groups may be more concerned or reticent about vaccinations. And although I think it's less of an issue now, obviously earlier on in the vaccine rollout, those who were younger would have to wait longer for their second jabs. So I think with all of these areas, there is the potential for claims for discrimination by requiring an employee to be vaccinated, or by treating them less favourably in some way if they are not. So I think a blanket policy potentially is problematic. You could come up against arguments for indirect discrimination, in particular, that you're imposing a requirement that people are vaccinated, and you are going to have to justify any such requirements. So unfair dismissal, if you dismiss somebody for refusing to be vaccinated or for refusing to disclose their vaccination status, you have to have a fair reason for that dismissal. It could potentially be something, so what we call some other substantial reason, but you would also need to have a fair process behind that and looking very carefully at whether or not there are other more proportionate means of achieving the same aim of reducing and preventing the spread of the virus. I won't go into these in any great detail, but clearly you can see that there may be human rights and data protection issues in all of this as well. So if I could go on to the next slide, please, Melissa. So obviously I've just talked through some of the advantages, disadvantages and risks of having a mandatory vaccination policy, and the need to be able to justify that. So it is, at least in theory, possible, but if you're looking at that, then you're going to have to think about updating current contracts for current members of staff. Looking at new staff, I think it is easier to justify a requirement as long as I said, that justification piece is there, and you're able to justify that to new people coming in, but query whether that will put new joiners off and whether or not that will reduce your access to the talent pool. So again, fairly fraught with difficulty, and it may well be that a mandatory vaccination policy for new starters is very much a disincentive, leading to difficulties in hiring new staff. So what we're seeing actually is people or employers tending more towards a vaccination encouragement or support policy rather than making it mandatory. So the aim is that you are encouraging and supporting as many of your staff as possible to get vaccinated. This could include provisions such as paid time off to go and get vaccinations. If there are any vaccine related side effects, then you would look to discount those from your normal sickness absence management procedures. And this is something that I think is very much recommended by ACAS guidance, ACAS being a conciliatory body that offers impartial advice to employers and employees. And I know Michael may sort of mention those in his slides later. So this sort of approach clearly is much less invasive than requiring people to have a vaccination. But if you do want to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, then I think the key takeaways are you must consult with staff, you must take on board their views, you must be prepared to make exceptions in appropriate cases, and crucially, you will need to have the justification, the objective justification behind that. So that's all that I wanted to say on mandatory vaccinations. So if we could flip onto the next slide, Melissa. Thank you. So I think the new normal, remote working, hybrid working, they're phrases that are being used almost on a daily basis as we are seeing it. It has a real impact on pay. And I wanted to start with looking at, in particular, London weighting. So this has typically and historically been added to salaries to cover the cost of living and working in the capital, because that is very, very high. But what happens when people stop commuting to the office and they have a London weighting, for example, in their contract? Do you still have to pay that? Will new starters still expect to receive that if they come to work in a job which is ostensibly still based in London? Suggesting, I think, that London weighting should be axed for remote workers, unfortunately, is not a straightforward question. Somebody may still live in London and have the high rental costs. And I think if you contrast that to a member of staff who works outside London, probably won't have London weighting, but in not commuting into the office and working remotely or in a hybrid manner, they will be saving commuting costs. So you've got the disparate impact across people that live in London and people that live outside. I think it is also absolutely relevant as to who is requesting any change in work location. And I think there is a fundamental difference between an employee saying, I would like to work from home 100% of the time, and an employer saying, well, actually, we only want you to come into the office for 50% of the week, and we want you to work from home for the other 50%. So I'm afraid there aren't any easy answers here. And the new normal really is not going to be a binary choice, save in rare cases, I think, between office or home working, and hybrid working, I think, very much will be the flavour of the day. So the key to all of this is, what does the contract of employment say? So if a premium is paid by way of London weighting, and that is conditional on the employee working in London, then there is scope to consult with that employee and say, well, you're no longer working in London. We need to look at and we need to talk about your London weighting. Pay is a fundamental term of the contract of employment, so we need to consult with employees and make sure that we are not doing anything untoward. I am conscious of time. There are a number of sort of options and legal risks around that, but I suspect there may be some questions. So if we could perhaps save that part of the discussion until we get to that point. And there are other risks regarding recruitment and retention, and I think Michael may be touching on those aspects as well. So if I can just move over to my next slide, Melissa. Home versus work location. So really, this is the extent to which you can require an employee to live within a certain commutable distance of their workplace. I think it's fair to say that employees generally should be free to choose where they live and where they work. But again, key issues around this are, what does the contract of, so that should say of employment, there's a typo on the slides there, apologies. what was the expectation on recruitment into the role? And I think perhaps crucially, what is the nature of the role? So there will be some jobs that require the employee to be within a certain travelling distance of the workplace. So example that springs to mind, I think, is a senior manager who's a key holder of a premises, and if there's an emergency, needs to be able to get there very quickly within 10-15 minutes. But I think for other office-based roles that can be performed very easily from home with a decent broadband connection, you are going to struggle much more to say you must live within a certain commuting distance from work. So I think that's probably enough from me. I'll hand over to Michael, but I just wanted to leave you and read out a recent advert from a non-league football club. I won't read all of it, but we are seeking a general manager to work directly alongside the director of football. This is a hands-on role and requires hands-on leadership from the front, so delegators and office dwellers, please don't apply. You will need to be proactive in your approach to everything. We work hard, so don't apply if you're looking for a work-life balance or have to pick the kids up from school twice a week at 3:30. You will need to live close to the club and immerse yourself in the local community at all levels. I'm sure we can all see there are many things wrong in that advert. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass over to Michael now.
Thanks, Caroline. So we're just going to touch on a few areas for the employment considerations for charities in the new world. I think, as Caroline and Jonathan have accurately described, things are going to change going forward. Next slide, please, Melissa. So what are we going to cover? Well, firstly, we're going to cover a little bit about employees' mental health and the duty of care. We're going to look briefly at the end of furlough, also at the new health and social care levy. Going to touch on recruitment and retention and follow on from what Caroline was just saying, and then just leave you with a couple of other considerations when operating differently from now on. Next slide, please. So the first topic really is culture, communication, mental health and well-being. And really what we're looking here is following on from what Caroline said, that you do have that duty of care. Next slide, please. And what does that actually mean for you as an employer? Well, it's making sure the working environment is safe, it's protecting the staff from discrimination, it's carrying out risk assessments. And the key thing that we've seen from lots of our charities who've been operating differently is actually it's very difficult to now keep up with employees in lots of different places in lots of different states. So whether you have key workers who have to go in, who may be worried about the virus, who may be worried about vaccinations. You've got your remote and home workers who you may not have so much of a connection to, who may be working differently from the way that they used to. But also you've got furloughed staff, you've got new joiners that you need to bed into the organisation, and also leavers who need to go through that formal process. Next slide, please. So really, in terms of mental health, it really is understanding your staff and looking out for those signs, and you need your managers to assist you with this. What we found is that actually in terms of kind of furloughed staff and also new joiners, regular check-in meetings are very important from lots of the charities that we've seen. Also reviewing people's workloads. It's actually much harder to see and understand necessarily people's workloads when you can't see it right in front of you, particularly when they're not working in the office. And actually it's very difficult to spot whether people are really understanding things or receiving the training that actually you have the duty to provide them to make sure that they do their job. And it's also asking your managers to look for the right signs. You know, are there any potential signs of distress or poor mental health? And a good part of that with your managers is role modeling, you know, seeking support for their own mental health if they need it, talking to your HR teams about well-being and mental health, prioritizing self-care and rest, and just being aware of those signs and symptoms in your staff. Next slide, please. So what are some of those kind of changes in behavior that we've been looking for? So it might be working long hours and not taking appropriate breaks. It might be that you're starting to see increased sickness in terms of absence or lateness, mood changes, distraction, withdrawal, irritability, perhaps uncharacteristic performance issues. And also, we can even go right down to disruptive or antisocial behaviour. I won't go through these in too much detail, but they are key things that we're starting to find that charities are paying more attention to, because as you've got people working in a variety of different places, their needs will be different. It's not the same as having everybody in one location where you can keep a much closer eye on this. So next slide, please. So this slide, I won't go through in any detail, but there's a couple of really useful links here, particularly for employers. So the wellness plans from Mind, a very useful organisation, and it's got a specific area there for coronavirus. And also the ACAS link there, which I think is always going to be very, very useful for you. If we could have the next slide, please. But the next thing I'd just like to talk about is the end of furlough. This is going to change how things will work on quite a lot of charities. So just for those who weren't aware, we had the furlough scheme ended on the 30th of September. We had over 1 million workers remaining on the scheme at that closure date. That is a significant number of employees. At peak, however, we had almost 9 million in May 2020, and some sectors are disproportionately affected. The voluntary sector is one of those. So our June 2020 DCMS figures revealed that 20% of all voluntary sector employees were furloughed at that point. So what do you need to do about this as a charity? Well, planning is really, really key here in terms of a sudden stop in that furlough income has quite a big impact on your budget, and then trying to relaunch the services that you were previously providing, you can end up with some employees in limbo and also costing the charity vital reserves that tick down away as those employees' salaries come through. There may also need to be quite a significant reinvestment in updated training for charities and service delivery methods. Don't forget that during the time many of these employees have been away whilst they've been furloughed, things have changed. It may be that you need to deliver services online, or it may be that the events type services that they perhaps worked on are not being run in the same manner. You really need to think about your duty of care to train and help your employees do their jobs in an effective manner. But another key area is producing financial analysis, and we honestly recommend that you do this sooner rather than later. Do not rely on previous budgets, because most of them had in multiple dates for furlough ending, and also lots of people kept thinking that actually they're just going to keep extending it. Well, they seem to have put their foot down now, and we are at the end of it. So do we need to consider cost-cutting measures, for example? Do we need to consider for those employees coming back whether we cut hours or expenses? Do we need to consider redundancy costs? And we do still have to go through a proper legally recognised redundancy process in that regard. And that's a little bit like Caroline was talking about earlier. None of the furlough scheme doesn't take away any of your responsibilities as an employer. And it's very important that you follow the right process in everything that you do. But there's also going to be that economic impact that actually, although furlough has ended, recovery is still very slow in some sectors that might rely on in-person events or attendance. So therefore, these activities are going to become harder and harder to sustain with your current level of staff. So that's something to think about. Financial sustainability is key, and looking at your forecasts and reforecasting on a regular basis is actually quite important. Next slide, please. And one of the things that you're probably going to have to reforecast for is the new health and social care levy. Yes, thank you. So just in case you haven't heard of it, I'm sure you have, this affects employees and employers liable to national insurance contributions. It's a 1.25% increase to the main and additional rates of class 1, 1A, 1B and 4. Those will go through national insurance for the first couple of years, so for the 22 and 23 tax years. And then the new health and social care levy as a separate tax, if you want to call it that, will be applied from 6th of April 23. Now, notice there that actually from the government's own wording, that's a starting rate. So what we need to be very careful of is that actually by the time we get to that point, there may be different rates applied, or there may be escalating charges. So it's a new cost. And therefore, as a new cost, you've got to make sure that you've really factored this into your forecasts and your budgets. But also don't forget that there's going to be costs of implementing it. So you could need systems or software updates, although they might be one-off costs. It's important to factor these in, particularly as it's going to be very difficult once we go past the national insurance system onto a new tax system from 23. Whatever your payroll system is, it needs to be able to handle that addition. But it's also worth noting there are no planned changes to the charity's employment allowance of up to £4,000 per annum as a deduction against Class 1 NICs. No changes at present, but again, with all these things, it's worth keeping an eye on it. But we'd also like to think about how it might affect your charity both internally and externally. So internal pressure will rise. Your staff may come to you and actually demand salary increases to make up for the 1.25%. The costs will rise all across your payroll, not just in key areas. And so your longer term budgets, if you've planned ahead 2 or 3 years, they are going to be affected. And if you have a significant number of employees, they may be affected by quite a large amount. But we also have to consider the external pressure. You know, as things become more difficult for people in general and as costs rise, the demands on charities tend to go up. They're counter-cyclical in many charity sectors, that as the economy goes down or pressure on costs rises around general people, this could push more vulnerable people towards poverty. There may be an increase, depending on what your charity does, on its needs and activities, but equally, there could be an external pressure on your actual ability to fundraise and the amount of donations that people give you if this affects their take-home pay. Next slide, please. So the last thing we want to talk about really is recruitment and retention. So kind of following on from what Caroline had said a little bit earlier. So just looking at recruitment in the sector at the moment, well, we know, just from general figures from the ONS that there are over 1 million job vacancies at the end of September 21. But employees on the payroll of firms are still 200,000 down on that pre-crisis level. So there is still flexibility in the system. There's obviously been quite a lot of attention on new immigration rules, putting some lower paid sectors in difficulty with locating staff or reliance on foreign workers. But a lot of this pressure is then beginning to build on salaries and rates. So the charity job website did some recent research last month, and they showed that average salaries in the sector have increased very quickly from 32.5 to 35 over the last few months. And a lot of this is that shortage of candidates. Those shortages and those increased salary might impact your delivery on services. It might impact your ability to invest in the number of staff that you want, or your ability to actually invest overall in the staff that you've got. And that's a key area here. So just moving to the other side of that slide, retention. So Caroline mentioned earlier, about the vaccine passports, that also looking at employees whose flexibility in their contracts and their home working. Well, you've got to be very careful that, you don't lose employees who you could reasonably keep who are still productive. Retention is a key issue in the sector at the moment, particularly as charities start to try to scale their activities back to those pre-pandemic levels. And that shortage of staff is increasing internal wage demands as well as external wage demands. So they often say it takes an average of about 2 years at a job before your salary begins to fall slightly behind what you might get if you came into that job as a new recruit. But in this case, we're actually seeing internal wage demands are putting significant pressure. So therefore, we've got some charity sectors who've got both a recruitment and a retention crisis. The care sector that we mentioned earlier, that is an acute risk at the moment. We do know that. But the key things to think about here are that you've got to plan and scale your activities carefully. Do not overreach and assume that you'll be able to recruit or retain all of those staff that you need quickly or easily. You may have a very difficult time in some sectors, particularly in the lower paid sector. So therefore, it's careful planning of what is possible to do within the reasonable timescale. And a second part of that is looking at how flexible you are. You know, it's going to be a key challenge for lots of charities and other employers in the future, maintaining that productivity whilst offering that flexibility to your staff. Next slide, please. So just to finish, really, was a couple of other considerations. There was a couple of other questions there. So one of them was, can the charity still deliver on its targets effectively if it's not working face-to-face, if it's remote working? We need to think about projects and grant funding. Are you able to deliver on those targets if the way that you work is going to change? Do the new ways of working actually increase costs or mean that fundraising applications don't actually cover the cost of what you're doing? You've really got to seek out full cost recovery when you're kind of funded from external funders or sources, things like grants, and new ways of working may impact that quite considerably, particularly as things like the health and social care levy is fairly new, and lots of your budgets when you applied for these things may have been done some time ago. And final question there really was, does the charity have the reserves available to invest in employees and new ways of working? Does it have available cash to invest in tech, in other areas like that, whilst also making sure that from a going concern perspective, you've got an appropriate amount of working capital and you've got your eye on the ball when it comes to those future forecasts and income generation? And that's about it from me. I think I will hand back to Jonathan now, who will have a look at some of the questions.
Great, thank you both. That was great. So some esoteric questions maybe, which are going to be difficult to answer, but just your thoughts, I suppose, will be good. We talked a lot about vaccinations, and vaccinations are going to be with us going forward for the duration, it seems. And we talked about vaccine hesitancy in some quarters. What levers are available to employers to incentivize staff to get vaccination? Can there be financial incentives or other nudges? Is that an appropriate thing to be doing? I'm throwing that open to the floor.
I'll start actually, and then Michael, I'm going to bat it back to you in a sort of slightly different way. Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes, you can offer incentives. I mean, I think didn't the government itself tried to offer incentives to younger age groups 2 or 3 months ago in terms of Deliveroos and various other incentives. So yes, absolutely. I think you can offer an incentive. Where you might come unstuck is if somebody says, well, that's great, but I can't have a vaccine and I've got a very good reason. So you're treating somebody better, you're giving them a prize or a reward or incentive or whatever you want to call it for having a vaccine, and I simply cannot do that. So it comes back to what is the justification for asking staff and incentivizing staff to have the vaccine. Michael, perhaps it's a bit unfair, but I suppose in all of that and in terms of any financial incentive, you'd have to think about sort of benefit in kind type arrangements possibly, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're going to kind of reward or reimburse staff in other ways, those can count as benefits in kind. I'm fairly certain that most of what we do would already be covered by existing legislation. So you can only really offer people, what's there and available. The other side of it is you need to kind of think about sort of reputational risk as well, sort of arguments, and I think the unfairness point that Caroline just raised, if that was to become, a known issue or sort of public, those kind of things can often have a detrimental impact on charities. But overall, I think it's probably within your objects to pay and reward your staff. That part of it is fine. But again, some of these things, if you're starting to hand them out to all staff, there can be a significant cost impact there. And it's probably worth thinking about, exactly as Caroline said, flagging up to your employees that there may be taxable parts of that they need to think about. But also as an employer, are you keeping an eye on your staff budget carefully?
A couple of questions, a bit more specific. So somebody's talking about what's going on with their organization and explaining that there is a freeze on recruitment. So they're taking on self-employed consultants to fulfill roles. What's the current IR35 risk with this strategy, given that they are a small charity?
Is that one for me or for Caroline?
Whoever feels.
Shall I kick off? IR35 is a big risk. There are very specific rules in place, and you really do need a formalized set of processes to look at the IR35 rules, because actually you should be running the calculator on HMRC's website, for each employee. The individual circumstances can be quite different from one employee on a contract to another, depending on what they do, what equipment they have, that kind of thing. So if you are moving to kind of a more contract-based system, I think there are dangers inherent in that. And actually, it's important to know IR35 with some reasonable detail and make sure that you've got the right processes in place to check on each individual employee as they come through the system and make sure that you're paying the appropriate taxes if required.
Thanks, Michael. Caroline, I'm going to ask you a different question.
I was just going to jump in just on that point. I mean, obviously, IR35 is with us. COVID, it was delayed for a year, I think, because of COVID, but it is with us now. So, if you are caught by the rules, you are caught by the rules, and COVID is not a get out of jail free card. Obviously, IR35 applies specifically where you have an intermediary sort of service company in place. So if you're engaging individual consultants, IR35 wouldn't apply, but what still applies, and it comes back to what Michael was saying, is being absolutely sure you are categorising your staff in the right way. It's critically important from a tax perspective, but also from an employment perspective. And if you are using self-employed contracts to fill roles that are otherwise in normal course of events would be employees, you work, thinking everybody's a contractor, you then fall out, and the employee then says, the individual, then says, well, actually, I am a de facto employee, and leaving aside the tax, I have a raft of rights that you have to recognise and deal with now.
Getting back to another COVID query, I suppose the question here really is about volunteers, and so just sort of taking a step back from the question asked is, to what extent do the responsibilities, obligations, levers available to the organisation apply equally to volunteers in terms of encouraging them to get a vaccine, notwithstanding they don't have any contractual relationship?
Shall I start with that one? So I think a key aspect of an employment relationship is control. Volunteers are meant to be sort of purely that, they come and go if they want to. Obviously, charities, you're very, very pleased to have them. And the more you start mandating people to behave in a certain way or do certain things, the more potentially that sort of level of control increases. Now, obviously, that is not the end of the story. There are other factors, both from an employment law and tax perspective, that will determine if someone is an employee. But what I would say is it again comes back to the justification as to why is it that you need that particular volunteer or group of volunteers to be vaccinated? Are they working, for example, with very vulnerable service users that are at a higher risk of getting COVID or being very, very unwell from COVID? So in theory, it's possible, but you need to rationalise why you need that to be put in place in terms of a policy. Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Not really. I think you've covered it very accurately there. I mean, I would just say that, following on from that, I think it is about that risk assessment and understanding why you might want to mandate that, but also that you want to be careful that you don't shrink the pool of potential volunteers, too much, because we often find one rule leads to another, and then you start sort of looking for very, very specific people. And actually, most of the benefits of volunteers is that they're drawn from all over society. So actually trying to mandate things could be quite hard to sustain the level of volunteers that you've currently got.
Great. Well, I think that's it. I think our time is up. So I hope everybody watching has found this session useful. I know I did. So please do join us next week, where we'll be thinking about how the charity of tomorrow grapples with governance and fundraising issues. So that just leaves it to me to thank Caroline. Thank you, Michael, for a really informative presentation. And I'm sure we can hear through the Wi-Fi the sound of applause, but unfortunately I don't have a sound effect to bring that to life. So until next time, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks everyone, goodbye.